will see additional acres brought in, arguably somewhere between 85 and 92 million acres nationwide. Translating that back to Iowa, that puts us in the 13.5 to 14 million acres of corn. Roughly a million acre increase from where we're at last year. And so we are seeing a substantial increase. But how does that compare to where we've been at in the past? So what I want to look at was, this is historical Iowa corn acreage, looking back to 1926, as far back as I can go with USDA data. And what you'll notice is we stay within a somewhat narrow bound, but we've had some extremes. We've been down to 9 million acres before. We've been up as high as 14.4. So having 13.5 to 14 million acres worth of corn planted here in Iowa is not outside our historical bounds. We've been there before, and it hasn't been that long ago. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, we planted 14 million acres of corn here in this state. We have seen that number of corn acres, and likely we're going to be there this coming year and in years to come. A lot of what you see there in that run-up arguably is tied with what was going on in the 1970s. We had fairly strong oil prices going on, which helped pull ag prices up. Those ag prices were attractive enough to induce more acreage. We also had strong government supports back through the 1970s and 80s, helping induce additional acreage into corn, especially in the case of the 1970s, out of favor would have been beans. Soybeans have now been added to the Farm Bill, and so that imbalance as far as government support is no longer there between those two crops. Again, looking at what we're seeing coming out of our models and what farmers are indicating through surveys, looking at the 2007 crop year, we do expect in Iowa 13.5 to 14 million acres worth of beans. So we're at the high end of our history, but we've been there before. And looking at futures prices as well for corn and soybeans, when we're looking out here for corn, right now we're staring at $4 corn. The futures market in Chicago is indicating that $4 corn will remain not only for 2007, but going out into 2008 and slightly dropping in 2009. So this is not a temporary phenomenon, at least the markets are not indicating it is, for inducing more corn acreage both in Iowa and nationwide. Now, the other thing I wanted to look at was how ag policy can play into this. And this is one of the areas when we talk about how this corn acreage, when it comes in, how is it going to impact the environment. I think one key factor here is how the Farm Bill is going to be shaped up for the next round here, for the next 5 years. We are right now in the midst of the debate for the next Farm Bill, which will be voted on later this spring or summer and put in place for the 2008 through arguably 2012 crops. So this will shape the ag policy that will influence corn farmers over the next 5 to 6 years, and arguably will have the biggest impact on the ethanol industry as it continues to grow. And I see two key titles to the Farm Bill as to where it's going to have the largest impact on how the biorenewables industry is going to impact the environment. And those two key titles are the conservation title and the energy title. The conservation title has been part of the Farm Bill basically as long as the Farm Bill's been around. The energy title was new in 2002, but is likely going to take a center stage as we look forward to the 2007 Farm Bill. And in looking at those areas, I'm going to talk about what we did in 2002 and sort of the chatter of what we're hearing that's going to happen for the 2007-2008 Farm Bill. In 2002, we did see a stronger push on the conservation title. There were more defenders in Congress for having stronger conservation programs within the Farm Bill. The biggest movement was in working lands programs, land that's still kept in agricultural production, but there are environmental bounds put on that production. There are incentives to bring environmentally sensitive practices into farming. So we saw a much greater effort in working lands than we have ever in the past. Arguably, before the 2002 Farm Bill, the concentration was on land retirement, pulling land out of production. So 2002 represented a major shift in how Congress looked at conservation programs. Looking forward for the 2007 Farm Bill, given the strong push we're seeing for increased corn production to fulfill some of this energy demand, arguably, is these working lands programs that can serve it and capture some of that production and put upon it some bounds to protect our environment. What I've listed here as well are some of the working lands programs that we have in place today, such as the Environmental Quality and Incentives Program, also known as QUIP. The idea is that this program is set up, it's targeting both crop and livestock producers, but it provides incentives for them to bring in to their practice some conservation practices to help hold quality to the soil, to maintain water quality, to minimize the environmental impact of their production practices. The new program was a conservation security program introduced by our own Senator Harkin. This is one that I see that has great potential as far as addressing some of the concerns as we ramp up corn production to fulfill biorenewable fuel needs. Because it is a program that is tiered, allows the producer to choose the environmental practices with which they want support for or incentives for, but at the same time maintaining their production to feed the biorenewable fuel needs. And there are other programs there as well. Again, looking at what we're seeing in 2007, many of the same congressmen that were pushing conservation in 2002 are back in 2007, and they're in leadership roles. For example, Senator Harkin is taking over as chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee. So I expect a stronger push in conservation than even that we saw in 2002. And that will help mitigate some of the effects of the increased corn acreage that we see coming online. The other title, again, was the energy title. Again, brand new in 2002, and we've seen a lot of action on energy from this administration and from this Congress. In 2002, we had this. In 2005, we had the separate Energy Act going there. But this act basically is saying that agriculture is becoming more and more tied to what we're seeing within energy markets. It recognizes that we're going to be, if you will, be pulled by what's going on in the energy market. And arguably, that's what we're seeing with corn. When we look at that $4 corn price, it's because of new demand driven by an energy market outside of our traditional agricultural markets. And it's going to be that pull from the energy markets that's going to have probably the greatest impact on agricultural markets looking out over the next 5 to 10 years. And so this is an explicit manifestation of that. The idea is it provides additional support from the federal government to bio-based products, be those fuels or other types of bio-based products. And in this case, Senator Harkin, again, has been a champion as far as introducing ag into the energy sector, providing biorenewable energy grants, both for producers and consumers of those products. And so we're seeing a strong push, at least on the federal government side, to try to address some of the issues as the biorenewable fuels industry grows and how those impacts are going to affect not only traditional agriculture, but how they're going to impact our rural economy and our environment. And with that, I'll thank you for your time.
I've had a lot of opportunity to sit on panels like this in the last couple of years. Not too long ago, I sat on a panel, or chaired a panel that consisted of representatives of various ethanol producing companies. And I asked them, I polled them, how many of you are producing a renewable fuel? And of course, all of them raised their hands. And I challenged them, I said, you know, you're not. You're producing a partially renewable fuel. And that's because you're using a lot of fossil fuels in the production of your renewable fuel. And the trend in moving away from natural gas to coal is going to just make that problem even worse. And I suggested that if they wanted to keep the environmental groups on their side, and most of them are, or at least neutral, is to make it work toward a truly renewable fuel, and it can be done. Another opportunity I had recently was to speak to the Governor's Ethanol Coalition. And I brought to them a message that the goal is not ethanol. Now that's a tough audience to sell that to. But I would bet most people in this audience would agree with me. The goal is not ethanol. The goal, we've got to decide what those goals are. And I have my own 4 personal best. And I've heard a lot of politicians recently list those as well. So I think the message is getting out. And I just want to make sure you would agree with me. The first one is improved energy security, or some would call it national security. This is not energy independence, by the way, but it is improving our energy security. That's a no-brainer. The second one is improved environmental performance. And maybe that's a no-brainer as well. Sometimes people don't think through all the implications. There's many. Reduce mercury emissions, reduce sulfur emissions, but you know the big one is the potential to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And it is a tremendous opportunity for agriculture in many ways. And I think that's one we need to explore. The other 2 don't generate as much excitement on the East and West Coast, but they should be exciting to us. And one is new markets for commodity crops. You can imagine on the East Coast they say, we really don't care about that. But you know, if we can get the price of corn high enough, we don't need a subsidy on corn anymore. And that means the American taxpayer is not paying for that subsidy. Farming becomes profitable in its own right. And I think we lost that side of that a long time ago. But let's get back to that point. And I think the 4th point is the notion of rural economic development. And we have a tendency in this state right now to be creating jobs in places like Des Moines, I guess Ames too, but Des Moines. The bioeconomy, as we call it, is all about producing jobs in outstate Iowa and other outstate locations in other agricultural states. And it's very important to people that live in places outside of Des Moines and Ames. We think that's a very important goal. So that's my list of 4. You may have others as well. I think there's tremendous opportunities for synergy through the development of biofuels and bio-based products. For example, if you're interested in conservation and energy efficiency, then buy renewable fuels. You know why? Because we're not going to be producing inexpensive renewable fuels. My goal is not to provide you $1 gasoline equivalent with renewable fuels. We just can't do it. You know, for a long time we've had essentially gasoline sitting in the ground. We pump it out and do a little bit of processing of it, and you put it in your fuel tank. We can produce very inexpensive motor fuels when those kinds of petroleum reserves exist. They're disappearing. There's still lots of petroleum, but it's not those pristine kinds of petroleum reserves. We're going to have to put more energy, more dollars into getting something that we're willing to put in our gas tanks. So I think we need to accept the fact we're going to be paying more for transportation fuels. And when that happens, people won't have to be forced to buy more efficient automobiles, right? Or live closer to work. You know, you hear about people that commute 2 hours each way, right? People are going to be less willing to do things like that. And renewable fuels will help make that possible. Another synergy that I see is if you support renewable fuels, then support greenhouse gas reduction programs. Why? Because if we do it right, renewable fuels will have a tremendous impact not only on the amount of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, but how much we can actually take out of the atmosphere. There's some real interesting proposals on using agriculture to sequester carbon in the soils. We can do it if we have an incentive to do it. And biofuels will, if we had these, something like a cap and trade program in carbon, then you would see advance the biofuels. So we call this the bioeconomy, the notion that we're going to substitute renewable sources of not only energy, but carbon for non-renewable, for fossil sources of energy and carbon. Both of those are important, by the way. And that was a lesson I learned in working with microbiologists. They always talked about these bacteria and what it took them to thrive and grow. They said it needed 2 essential things: a source of energy and a source of carbon. You know, in our society, we tend to think we just need the energy. We also need a source of carbon. And right now we're using a non-renewable source, a fossil source, petroleum, producing things like carpets and plastic bottles and just about anything that you can think of that isn't concrete or wood. Seems to be produced from petroleum today, or metal. And we need to look at a renewable source. We've got lots of renewable energy sources, wind, solar, you name it, biomass. But we've only got one source of renewable carbon, and that'll come from agriculture. So again, agriculture is going to play a very important role. The bioeconomy is actually a time for dreamers. We're seeing people come in, young people come in with big ideas, an opportunity to dream about things that just a few years ago there wasn't an opportunity to dream in that fashion. And they include things like, as I've already mentioned, using agriculture as a way to sequester carbon dioxide, to recycle nutrients between the production system and the processing system. There's opportunities. There was some talk about water usage. How about producing renewable fuels that doesn't require a distillation step? And that's where most of that water is going. There's some work being done at Iowa State University to do that. And my favorite is how about getting the fossil fuels out of ethanol production? We can do that too. And I'm working with a company that is building that technology today to make that happen. So there's lots of opportunities, but we do have to keep in mind what our goals are in achieving these dreams. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions from the audience? There's a microphone in the center here, or we don't have a cordless microphone, I'm sorry.
My name is Jahanshir Golchin. I'm a director of Energy and Environmental Research Group, an international group. I want to congratulate the panel here. I enjoyed especially the first one and the last one. I think they nailed the head issues very much. I have 3 comments which you could interpret them as a question. The first one, as a former regulator, as the one who wrote some of the Superfund rules, something that I'm realizing based on my superficial knowledge, what is going on with regard to the rapid expansion of ethanol plants. It is illegal, and I tell you what, under the environmental and energy rules of Federal Registry and also the National Oil Contingency Plan, which they have 12 very specific rules. They call it 12 Commandment, which is Superfunds and other environmental rules are based on. And we may think, okay, the politician and Senator Harkin may lobby to change them, but I tell you what, that would create not only national and international environmental turmoil. This is something that, I don't know, since 1964, everybody has been working to put that 12 commandments together. I'm not making any specific position on that, just...
So is your question, what is the status of that, or is that just the comment part?
No, this is a comment, okay, but again, right, that should be considered. Has anybody looked at the legality of not having a comprehensive environmental study, which also, when I say I have to emphasize on a comprehensive, which also look at all the legal aspect of it.
I appreciate your comments, but I would prefer if you had a question.
No, that's the question. I say, have anybody look at the that this rule and regulation has been looked at it? I mean, or we're just going out and building, look at it, we're building refineries. What is the difference between the ethanol plant and any chemical plant? So have anybody look at it? That's number one.
Let's just take one question at a time and then open it up for further ones. Does anybody have any response to that at all? Maybe Robert?
Well, the ethanol plants are coming under increased scrutiny. You're correct that they were built in an environment possibly that didn't include all the possibilities. For example, when they have a residue stream called distillers' dry grains, and when they dry it, it's kind of like baking bread, and some people call it the baking bread smell of an ethanol plant. Some people find it offensive close up and every day. And it's volatile organic compounds, VOCs, being emitted. And now there's EPA has ruled that they have to put in essentially afterburners to eliminate that. That increases their energy usage, so it's one of those vicious circles types thing. In terms of these 12 points, I don't know. I can't say I can say they're responding specifically to those, but they are under scrutiny by the EPA, for example.
Yeah, but in response to that comment, is not, see, EPA write the rule, doesn't write the codes,
Right.
like any regulatory agency. So I see a potential, let's say, from oil-producing states such as Texas and other places who push those lawyers to come up north and create problem. Again, that was a mix of question and comment. Thank you. And the second one is, again, the last speaker, you mentioned that we're creating an easy path of resistance to basically derail and push back for decades, as happened since the time of Eisenhower, then the Nixon and Carter. The derail are the R&D for efficiency and alternative technology. And are we taking away any resources? Have anybody done any study to see that how much of these resources, you kind of briefly mentioned to that, how much of those researches are being put on the back burner?
Well, at the Department of Energy, all of that work is done under what's called the energy efficiency and renewable energy. So they get both of those areas, the new sources and the efficiency efforts. In terms of the distribution between those, I can't comment. I certainly know the budget of EERE is ramping up specifically because of the interest in biofuels, and whether there's a ramp up in the energy efficiency issue, I don't know. But I do think we're going to see it play out where it's going to become more important, because consumers are going to start saying we need more efficient vehicles because we're paying too much for gas. Or they could say, let's subsidize ethanol and biofuels to even greater extent so we don't have to pay so much at the pump. I think that would be a mistake.
And my last question, and I apologize to the rest of the people who may have questions. The panel in general mentioned that Iowa and Illinois and perhaps Nebraska becoming a leader, but shouldn't we also be a front runner for the moral reasoning and social responsibility, as, for example, Stanford University now have a step in to look at our ethical responsibility with regard to this issue. When I was listening to the gentleman who was giving example of biodiesel fuel in Africa and South Africa, it sort of made me to shake to see that, oh, we're burning source of a protein in South Africa while millions in other parts of the continent are suffering. Are we going to look at that moral reasoning and social responsibility?
I think people here in the state are taking that responsibility very seriously. People like Fred and the folks at the Leopold Center. And so, Fred, do you want to handle this query? Or
well, I think that we're making some small efforts in those directions, but not anything near what we have to be doing in order to face the kind of challenges that we're facing as a global community. A number of my friends who have been writing about this in recent years are saying that the real agenda before us now is to reinvent the human. It's not adjusting the environment to meet our needs. It's that we have to adjust ourselves to meet, to be consistent with the resources of the planet. I mean, we have for the last 2 centuries been living on our ecological capital, and as the UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report pointed out, and this was put together by almost 1,400 scientists from 95 countries, that we have now so compromised our ecological capital that 60% of the Earth's ecosystems are at the point of collapse. And that includes our oceans, which we sometimes forget contain 90% of the biological life on this planet, which is absolutely essential to the resilience of the planet. So, for us to simply talk about how are we going to meet our energy needs as humans, in the context of those realities is, in my view, while important, but a little silly if we don't, pay attention to these larger issues. So I think you're right. I mean, we're not taking seriously our real situation at this point of our existence on the planet. And the really big elephant in the room, as we all know now, is climate change. I mean, because that's one we can't come back from. We're at 380 parts per million now, and what we already have in motion now will continue to increase that for at least the next 30 or 40 years. And at least Jim Hansen said a year ago we had 10 years to turn this around. And that meant major changes in terms of the amount of CO2s and other greenhouse gases we're putting into the environment. I mean, so we've got 9 years left now. And if we cross that point, then there's no return. I mean, the climate will fundamentally change for 100 or 200,000 years. And at least James Lovelock is saying that that means the planet will probably be able to support about 500 million people, and we'll all be living on the Arctic caps, because that's the only place that will sustain human life. Now, he could be wrong about that to some extent, but most of the climatologists have agreed. So this is a serious problem, and we're not really addressing it in any kind of comprehensive way, I don't think.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. And again, please go.
Yeah, just to clarify a point, when I brought up the issue about South Africa and Brazil, I had looked at that as a historic, what has happened in terms of using vegetable oils, which is not currently being used. In South Africa, that happened during the oil embargo, during the apartheid regime. South Africa right now is cautiously looking at promoting biorenewables, but the biggest concern that is there is that how can you diversify what's being put for the food chain for human consumption to oil? So that is a concern. That in some of the countries, including South Africa, they are looking into that issue. What we use for oils that does not compromise what's being used for human consumption.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't want to just leave by bringing question which may appear to be criticism. What you mentioned, the panel chair, you said that, well, the issue being mentioned, and this is why I brought up that question. I read Fred's commentary on the Leopold journals, but that is where the only place I see being reflected. We should see more of Fred's comment, and also the last gentleman, unfortunately I can't remember his name, in the front page of the Des Moines Register and other people, rather than to be cheerleader for what is going on. And one last comment with regard to the lady from Sierra Club. To be protector of the environment, we should be more vigilant, not vigilant to go and beat up the people. Perhaps by me coming up here, I'm losing millions of potential clients for our groups. But we should go out and talk about against something that down the road are hurting the human being on our planet. And this position to say, oh, we're not going to shake the boat and not to make the people who are in the production of ethanol, the Sierra Club, not going to do that. We have to be basically telling them what is the truth, no matter whose feeling we're going to hurt. And that presentation was kind of hurtful for me, who is supporting the Sierra Club. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Neela, would you like to respond to his comment?
Well, I think we do tell the truth, but it's just we're not. We are telling the truth about it, but we just haven't come out and said we oppose it or we support it. But I think you saw we are trying to educate people on what can happen, and then hopefully, I mean, it can't just be Sierra Club, banging the drum on this. It has to be everyone.
My name is Steve Acey, and I volunteer with a number of environmental groups in the state, always on water quality issues, and that's my question relates to water quality. There's no question we're going to be putting a lot more acres into row crop production, and there's no question that that's going to have a very serious effect on water quality in our rivers, lakes, and streams. In the past, our water quality strategy for the agricultural industry has been based upon incentives and voluntary measures, even for regulatory programs. In essence, allowing the agricultural industry to externalize the cost of protecting water quality from the consequences of crop choices and production methods. And I have often called this the curse of voluntary compliance, as kind of an oxymoronic choice of words. My question is, with the increased profitability of commodity crop production, has the time finally come when we can call for mandatory water quality protection measures to apply to the agricultural industry?
Let the economist handle
Yeah. I step into that.
Good call.
I think we will see some discussion of mandatory implementation here. Within the farm programs themselves, there are conservation compliance to receive program payments now, but arguably those are minimal standards compared to some of the environmental protections we would need to put in place given the expansion we're going to see in row crop production over the next few years. And it is true that when we look at what congressional leadership is offering out there now, we will probably see more continuation of voluntary request for stronger environmental moves as opposed to mandatory, but likely with higher incentive packages put forward to induce that voluntary reaction.
The gentleman who showed the graph of the number of acres in tillage and how we had a high of 14 million in the early 70s and then a drop, that drop corresponds to the time when we enrolled a lot of acres in CRP. And I can tell you without any doubt, the one thing we've done in this state to improve water quality has been CRP. And if we tinker with that and take lands out of production, out of CRP and put into row crop production, we're going to see serious effects on our rivers, lakes, and streams. And so I think the time has come, if we're going to continue to subsidize this industry, that we call for mandatory water quality protection measures for the ag industry. Thank you.
Next question.
I had a quick question and then a more general question, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to address you generically because I forgot all of your names. But The Economist, I was wondering if we're kind of setting ourselves up a bubble in the corn market that could potentially drop and leave a lot of farmers stranded with all these acres in production.
I guess there's always a potential for that to happen. I'm going to argue this is probably stronger than a temporary bubble just because we are tied to an energy market which is ever increasing, as has been mentioned here, not only in the U.S. but worldwide. And with the, especially with the, I guess, short run we've seen in ethanol over the past few years, arguably a lot of the plants that were built in 2002 have been able to pay themselves off by now. And so they'll be able to survive, if you will, in much tighter energy markets than they would have been in the past. And so that will help maintain what we're seeing in the corn market today.
Let me respond to that too, because I'm, among other things, I'm a farmer, and I left a career in higher education to go back to our farm in North Dakota to manage it in 1976. And those of you who are old enough to remember will recall that we had a somewhat similar kind of economic boom in the mid-1970s, and then it was driven by exports. And I knew about farming when I went back to manage the farm because I grew up on it, but I had not really, kept in tune with what was happening in the market. And so I wanted to inform myself about what these prices meant. And we were selling hard red spring wheat for $7 a bushel and durum wheat for $9 a bushel in the mid-1970s. And if you adjust that for inflation, you can figure we're probably twice that if we had those prices now. And so I subscribed to all of the professional journals. I talked to our ag economists at North Dakota State University, and everybody was saying the same thing. The demand for exports are going to remain because we've got an increasing human population, and so these prices are now going to stay in place. And I was told even that the 80s were going to be boom years for agriculture, and that if nothing else, this was a good time to expand. And so even if you needed to borrow money to expand, this was the thing to do. So I went and talked to my father, who had a 6th grade education, And so I said, Dad, this is what I'm learning. What do you think? And he said, well, you're going to manage the farm now, so it's your responsibility. But he said, for one thing, I don't think I'd borrow a lot of money. And I said, well, tell me, why is that the case? And he said, I've been farming here for 50 years now. I've never been able to dictate the price of anything that I've sold or the cost of anything that I buy. When you're in that situation, it's not a good idea to borrow a lot of money. Okay, good advice. And then he said something really important. He said, you'll notice, if you've paid attention, you'll notice that as these prices have gone up for everything that we sell, the price of everything that we have to buy has also gone up. Land rents have gone up, price of combines have gone up, price of tractors have gone up, even the parts that we buy have gone up. And when you looked at the data, it was exactly right. And then he said, I think that this is the worst thing that could ever happen to us as farmers. I said, what do you mean? Finally we're getting paid for, our labor and, making some money. And he said, yeah. But he said, when the price of wheat goes down again, and it will, he said, then the price of everything that went up that we buy is not going to come down to that same level and to coincide with the price we're going to get for wheat, and we'll be worse off than we were before. And of course it was that, not entirely, but in part, that generated the crisis of the agricultural crisis of the 1980s. Now I have to tell you, I worry a little bit. I'm not saying these are exact parallels, but we do know that the oversupply of ethanol at 10% usage, we will, all of the projections are we're going to hit that, probably in the next couple of years. And 85 vehicles are not going to come on, fast enough in order to, so we'll reach an oversupply situation. So we should expect that there's at least the potential for a price crash. But if that happens, do you think land rent is going to go back to $150 an acre? It's at $240 now, and probably, at least some of my friends who are economists are saying that could very easily hit $400 by the time this writes itself out. So I think that there is good reason for caution, which I think you're suggesting in your question. And I think my father's sixth grade education advice was pretty good, and we ought to at least pay a little bit of attention to it today.
The other question I had was, perhaps one of the underlying themes of this, or what I was taking from it, is that the future of the energy economy is going to be very broad-based, or at least that would be the ideal. And I was wondering if all of you had suggestions about changes in infrastructure, behavior, and policy that might make that happen faster.
If that's a desirable goal, faster?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would assume so.
Oh, yeah. Well, I hinted at some of them. A cap and trade program in carbon would have a big impact on the biofuels economy. I know that because I've talked to the economists about that, and they seem to think that would be a big impact. Clearly, I think if we went to improving efficiency of higher CAFE standards for automobiles, the miles per gallon, would be important to it. But I do think there is a lot involves individuals in decisions that they make on how they use energy. And it is hard to make a wise decision when fuel is very inexpensive. I think we start to think more about it as the price goes up. So again, I think the worst thing for us is for gasoline to go back to $1 a gallon. I smiled when it came to $3 a gallon. And because I'm paying for gas like everybody else, but I knew that it meant there were going to be opportunities to move into these renewable fuels, and people were going to start making decisions about what kind of automobiles they bought, et cetera.
The scarcity or upcoming scarcity of water is a concern of mine. I personally think that we will be fighting over water like the way we fight over oil now sometime in the future. And one of your statistics concerning the 3-to-1 ratio when creating ethanol, I guess in the distillation process, this might be a naive question, but I wonder where that water goes. Does it evaporate? Does it turn into wastewater sewage? And are there ways for it to be recycled, returned, maybe have a self-contained system where you keep the water and you don't have to continue to draw it from the ground?
Most plants today are considered zero discharge. In other words, they do not discharge any water from the plant. They do have various byproduct streams that they're able to use. It'd be fascinating if you have an opportunity to visit an ethanol plant and see how all these streams diverge and then they converge into a few products. Most of that water does go up in smoke in the sense that it evaporates. Now, you could recover that, but it takes energy to recover that energy. You're going to pull up cold groundwater to cool that evaporated water to recover it, and then you're increasing your water usage. So most of them right now take the view is it evaporates from the plant.
Yeah, another thing that concerns me about the water issue is not just the amount of water that's used in the ethanol plants, but think with me for a minute here. You're a farmer. And so you're now paying $240 an acre for rent, and some projections are that before this plays it's out, we'll be at $300 or $400 an acre. Okay. Now, if you're paying $400 an acre for rent, can you afford a crop failure? I mean, if corn is $4 or $5 a bushel, it doesn't make any difference. You got a failure. You got all these costs. So what's the rational thing to do? Well, the rational thing to do is to install a center pivot irrigation system as a hedge against drought. Particularly because climate change is going to bring us more unstable climates, and so more droughts and more floods, etc. So even in Iowa, with 30% average rainfall, I think you're going to see center pivot irrigation systems go up. That's going to be an additional drain. And then when you go to continuous corn, you're not creating the kind of soil system which absorbs and retains more water, so you're going to have an additional need for irrigation. So I think, again, we have to think about all these in terms of whole systems, and try to figure out, how we put. And I'm not opposed. I hope you understand. I'm not opposed to biofuels. I think they have a place in our system. I think this notion that we have, at least in the popular media, that all we got to do now is shift from fossil fuels to biofuels, and then we can all just continue to live the way we always have. And I think that's a fantasy.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I'm old enough, like many of you, to remember the first energy crisis. The energy crisis we have now is actually a crisis of demand, not supply. We're using huge amounts more than we used to use, and that has got to somehow come to center stage in this discussion. I don't know how to do it. I would like suggestions from you panelists who are part of this larger community of people considering this ethanol thing. We have to demand that the discussion be broadened in some very significant way, and there needs to be some way to get this university to help us do that. Like your comments.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, energy conservation has to be a part of this. And I think one of the things that frightens us about energy conservation, we automatically think this is going to require a reduction in our quality of life, right? We don't want to, don't want to lose our quality of life. But there's a lot of evidence out there that that's simply not the case. We have increased our energy consumption just in the last 10 years by something like 25%. Now, life wasn't that bad 10 years ago. And if you recall, in the 1970s energy crisis, the city of Los Angeles, because they felt that we were not going to be able to secure all of our oil resources from the Middle East to replace, our having reached peak oil in the United States. And so the city of Los Angeles in 1973 mandated a 12% decrease in energy consumption within 12 months. And they actually put in place some fairly stringent penalties if segments of the city did not comply with that. Well, at the end of 12 months, they had actually reduced their energy consumption by 17%, and no one had to had any penalties leveled against them. And how did they do it? Well, they did it with things like the baseball stadium decided to start the games at 7:30 instead of 8 o'clock, reduce their energy consumption by 10%. There are a lot of solutions out there that do not have to affect our quality of life. It's a different way of doing things. And ultimately, I think one of the cultural issues, and this gets, this is a conference sponsored by the humanities and the arts, and one of the cultural things that I think we have to come to terms with, and Bill McKibben spoke to this a little bit night before last, and that is that wealth does not automatically equal quality of life. It's well-being that equals quality of life. And well-being, as we know from all kinds of examples on this planet, it is being achieved by communities of people who really don't have a lot of wealth. In fact, they're more successful at it than we are. So we have some major, again, this reinvention of the human is, I think, the big agenda for the next couple of decades before us. And this doesn't mean that we don't need to deal with some of these technological issues and figure out our energy sources. We've got to move from stored energy to current energy. That's very clear. We've got to move from externalizing our waste to converting waste into useful systems. I mean, that's all part that's got to happen. We've got to maintain biodiversity because that's the ultimate resilience of the planet. So these are the big agendas. We've got to make those changes, but we've also got to reinvent ourselves because we cannot live on the assumption that continuing this extractive economy is the only way to maintain a quality of life, because all the evidence is that it's not.
My question is concerning water again, and it's my understanding that despite the map shown by the Sierra Club, there's actually very little information about our current water resources, especially in northeast Iowa and areas where the topography is unique. So my question, I guess, is about the new Farm Bill, which has major implications, and if there's any language in it to address research about the current state of our water resources and perhaps monitoring of how they will be affected by ethanol plants and other uses.
I'll take that one. I don't know about the Farm Bill, but in the legislature right now and with the governor, we're trying to push to get a new water plan written up, so we'll have all of that information. I think a lot of the data is available through the DNR, and the USGS, but it's just not combined in one spot. But the last time we had a water plan in Iowa was in 1985, I believe, and so we feel like that's crucial now, especially with this onslaught of ethanol plants, that we do know exactly how many water resources we have and where they are. You might check the DNR website. There is a presentation that was done by Bob Libra that has a lot of information about water resources in the state.
In terms of the Farm Bill, there's not anything specific as far as measuring water quality, as far as a program meant to be set up there. But within some of the conservation programs, there are, if you will, general guidelines looking at how to implement those programs to improve water quality without setting necessarily any specific standards upon that. That's typically done at the regulatory stage as opposed to within the legislation.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you so much for attending today. Let's give our panelists.